It was 5:47 in the morning when Corrections Officer Dana Wyatt tapped her pen against her clipboard and stopped walking. She had completed the early count hundreds of times before. The routine was almost mechanical, cell to cell, face to number, number to name. But on this particular Tuesday in late October, something was wrong. Not loudly wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Just the quiet, unsettling kind of wrong that takes a moment to fully register. 2 bunks. 2 sets of folded blankets. 2 names on the roster. 0 inmates. Within minutes, Hargrove Correctional Facility in rural central Pennsylvania was placed on full internal lockdown. Supervisors were paged. The overnight shift was pulled back in. And somewhere deep inside the aging concrete structure, in a network of narrow passages that most staff had never seen and some had never even heard of, 2 men had simply ceased to exist within the system that was built to contain them. Their names were Tilley and Deon Farris. Tilley was 38 years old, a former auto mechanic from Pittsburgh who was serving a 14-year sentence for a series of armed robberies that had stretched across 3 counties. Those who knew him inside described him as disciplined and quiet. Too quiet, some said in hindsight. The kind of man who watched things carefully and never wasted energy on noise. Farris was 31, originally from Baltimore, convicted on federal drug trafficking charges that had been compounded by a violent altercation during an earlier county detention. He had 2 years left on his sentence, a fact that would later confuse investigators almost as much as anything else about the case. Why would a man this close to release risk everything? That question would define the investigation for weeks. Hargrove Correctional was not a supermax facility. It was what the Department of Corrections classified as a medium-security institution, home to roughly 900 inmates at the time. But the building itself had a complicated history. Originally constructed in the mid-1960s, it had been expanded twice, once in 1979 and again in the early 1990s, with each addition creating new seams in the facility's physical layout. Walls didn't always align perfectly. Utility corridors didn't always appear on updated blueprints. And the ventilation system, a sprawling network of metal ductwork that ran through nearly every wing of the building, had been partially retrofitted and partially forgotten. That ventilation system, investigators would soon discover, had become the blueprint for something months in the making. Within the first hour of the discovery, a search team located the entry point in cell 214B, the cell shared by Tilley and Farris. A maintenance access panel behind the lower bunk had been carefully removed. The screws had been backed out so precisely that the panel appeared, at a glance, to still be in place. Closer inspection revealed that the original screws had been replaced with shorter ones, filed down to the exact visible length, held in place with nothing more than a small amount of toothpaste serving as adhesive. It was patient, methodical craftsmanship, the kind that does not happen in a single night. Investigators later estimated the preparation had taken at least 4 to 6 months. The question of how 2 inmates had obtained the tools necessary for this level of work sent an immediate shockwave through the facility's administration. An internal audit was quietly launched alongside the criminal investigation. But in those first chaotic hours, the priority was simple and urgent. Find them. State police were notified. A perimeter was established around the facility and the surrounding rural area. Canine units were deployed. Drone surveillance was authorized. And a call went out to the facility's own maintenance department, because if these men were in the ventilation system, someone who knew that system was going to be needed to navigate it. What the maintenance supervisor told investigators when he arrived was not reassuring. He stood at the entrance to the utility corridor, studied the schematic on his tablet, and shook his head slowly. The ductwork, he explained, connected to 11 separate wings. It ran beneath the administrative offices, past the infirmary, and, most critically, toward an exterior utility housing on the northeast side of the property that had last been physically inspected 14 months ago. But when investigators pulled the external housing records and reviewed the facility's most recent surveillance archive, they found something that stopped the room cold. The northeast exterior camera had been manually rotated, just 2 degrees, sometime in the previous 72 hours. Enough to leave a precise blind spot. Exactly where a man might need one. 2 degrees. It sounds almost trivial. a margin so small it would be easy to dismiss as a camera settling on its mount, a vibration from a passing truck, or simple mechanical drift. But Sergeant Raymond Coble, the lead investigator assigned to the escape case by the Pennsylvania State Police, was not the kind of man who believed in coincidences inside a correctional facility. He had spent 19 years working criminal investigations, the last 7 of them specializing in institutional security failures. He had seen riots, cover-ups, and contraband operations sophisticated enough to rival small businesses. But standing in the security monitoring room at Hargrove that morning, studying the footage of that camera's subtle repositioning, he felt something he later described to colleagues as a cold recognition. This was not impulsive. This was engineered. The camera adjustment had occurred at 11:23 p.m. on the Saturday prior, 3 days before the missing person's discovery. The footage showed nothing dramatic. No figure approaching the camera housing. No obvious tampering. Just a clean, almost imperceptible shift in the frame between one timestamp and the next. Someone had accessed that camera either remotely or physically during a window when the monitoring room was staffed by a single officer managing multiple screens simultaneously. Coble requested the full roster for Saturday night's shift. He also requested something far more sensitive, a list of every maintenance request, work order, and facility access log going back 1 full year. What came back was a document that would quietly redirect the entire investigation. Over the preceding 11 months, Cell Block D, the block housing both Tilley and Farris, had generated an unusually high volume of minor maintenance requests. Flickering lights, a reportedly malfunctioning heat vent, a drain issue in the communal bathroom. Each request was small, routine, and entirely plausible on its own. But together, they formed a pattern. And each work order had been handled, in whole or in part, by the same facility's maintenance employee. His name was Gerald Hobbs, 51 years old, a civilian contractor who had worked inside Hargrove for going on 9 years through a private maintenance company. By all accounts, he was unremarkable, punctual, polite, the kind of employee whose presence becomes so familiar it eventually becomes invisible. Investigators brought Hobbs in for questioning on the second day. He was calm, almost unnervingly so. He denied any involvement, expressed what appeared to be genuine concern, and voluntarily handed over his personal phone without being asked. It was a gesture that initially read as cooperation. It would later read as confidence, the confidence of a man who believed he had not made a mistake. He was wrong. While Coble's team focused on Hobbs, a secondary team was still working the physical trail, the path Tilley and Farris had actually taken through the ventilation system. What they found inside those ducts over the following 48 hours was extraordinary in its detail. The 2 men had clearly mapped their route. Taped to the interior wall of the duct, roughly 30 feet from the entry point in their cell, investigators found a hand-drawn diagram. It was rendered on the back of 2 repurposed commissary receipts, sketched in pencil with a precision that suggested multiple revisions. The diagram showed the duct layout in rough but functional form, marked with what appeared to be timing notations, numbers that investigators eventually cross-referenced with shift change schedules and lighting cycles throughout the facility. Someone had given them information about internal operations that inmates simply should not have had. There was also a small cloth bundle found wedged into a junction point deeper in the system. Inside it were 2 pairs of latex gloves, a short section of wire, and a folded piece of paper containing a 7-digit number. The number did not match any internal facility extension. It took forensic analysts less than 4 hours to determine it was a prepaid cell phone registered to a name that did not exist. Back in the interview room, Gerald Hobbs was shown a photograph of the cloth bundle. For the first time since investigators had sat down with him, his composure shifted. It was not a confession. It was not even a flinch, exactly. But Sergeant Coble, a man who had spent nearly 2 decades reading people in small rooms, later said it was the moment he knew. The question was no longer whether Hobbs was involved. The question was how deep the arrangement went, who else was connected, and most urgently, where Tilley and Farris actually were. Because despite 2 full days of search operations, canine sweeps, drone coverage, and a widening statewide alert, the two men had not been found outside the facility, which meant investigators were forced to consider a possibility that had quietly been forming at the edge of the inquiry since the very first morning. What if they had never made it out at all? The shift in the investigation came not from a tip, not from surveillance footage, and not from anything Gerald Hobbs eventually said in that interview room. It came from a sound. On the third day of the search, a maintenance worker named Carlos Vega was assigned to physically inspect a secondary duct junction in the northeast utility corridor, the same general area where the exterior camera blind spot had been created. He was not looking for the men. That possibility had largely been set aside by that point, given that 3 days had passed and the assumption of successful escape had begun to take hold in the operational briefings. Vega was simply doing his job. And then he stopped. Later, in his written statement, he described it as a faint rhythmic sound, like something tapping against metal from the inside. Slow. Deliberate. Not the sound of the building settling or air moving through the system. Something intentional. Something communicating. He called it in immediately. Within 20 minutes, Sergeant Coble and a full response team were on site. They traced the sound to a sealed expansion junction, a section of ductwork that had been closed off during the 1993 renovation and was no longer part of the active ventilation circuit. It did not appear on the current maintenance schematic. It existed, essentially, as a forgotten cavity inside the building's skeleton. The access panel to that junction had been sealed with industrial bolts. When technicians removed it, the air that came out was stale and warm. Marcus Tilley and Deon Farris were inside. Both men were alive. Tilley was in significantly worse condition, dehydrated, disoriented, and suffering from what the responding medical team identified as the early stages of heat exhaustion. Farris was weakened but coherent. Neither man had eaten in more than 60 hours. They had been trapped in a space roughly the size of a large storage closet in complete darkness for the better part of 3 days. The reconstruction of what had gone wrong came together quickly once investigators had access to the physical evidence and, eventually, partial statements from Farris himself. The plan had been precise in its design but fatally flawed in one critical assumption. Tilley and Farris had navigated the ductwork successfully using their hand-drawn diagram, reaching the northeast junction on schedule in the early hours of Tuesday morning. The exterior housing, they believed, would open outward into a low-visibility area of the grounds, the blind spot they had carefully engineered with the camera adjustment. But the information they had been given about that exterior access point was wrong. The 1993 renovation had rerouted the exterior housing. What their diagram showed as an outward exit was, in reality, the sealed junction they ultimately became trapped inside. The structural change had never been reflected in the older facility documents that had been used to build their route. Gerald Hobbs, investigators later concluded, had provided information that was itself based on outdated records. Whether that was intentional misdirection, negligence, or simply the limit of what he had access to remained a matter of legal debate throughout the subsequent proceedings. What was not debatable was the criminal exposure that followed. Hobbs was arrested on the 4th day. A search of his vehicle and his home produced a prepaid phone matching the number found in the cloth bundle, along with $3,000 in cash and a series of encrypted messages that forensic analysts spent weeks partially reconstructing. The messages suggested the arrangement had involved at least one additional party outside the facility, someone who had allegedly promised payment upon successful extraction of both inmates. That external party was never conclusively identified, though investigators developed a strong person of interest who ultimately could not be charged due to insufficient direct evidence. Hobbs was charged with aiding and abetting escape, conspiracy, and multiple counts related to his abuse of facility access. He accepted a plea agreement and was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. He served 4. Tilley had 3 years added to his existing sentence following a disciplinary hearing and a separate criminal proceeding for attempted escape. He became notably less quiet in the years that followed, according to facility staff. Some interpreted that as anger. Others thought it looked more like a man processing the specific humiliation of a plan that had trapped him more completely than the prison itself ever had. Farris, the man with 2 years left, received an additional 4. He was transferred to a higher security facility in western Pennsylvania and, by all available records, completed that sentence without further incident. He has not spoken publicly about what those 3 days in the dark were like. Whatever he experienced in that sealed junction, the heat, the silence, the slow understanding that no one was coming from the outside, he has kept entirely to himself. The camera on the northeast exterior was replaced and repositioned. The sealed junction was permanently welded shut and added to the updated facility schematic. Hargrove conducted a full internal audit, retrained its monitoring staff, and revised its contractor access protocols. But the question that lingered, the one that serious institutional security researchers would return to in the years following the case, was not about the men who got trapped or the employee who helped them. It was about the building itself, about how a correctional facility operating for decades could contain within its walls a forgotten space that appeared on no current document, that no active staff member knew about, and that 2 inmates in a medium security wing had somehow learned to find. It raised a quieter and more unsettling question. Not about these 2 men. Not about this one facility. About how many other institutions are carrying the same kind of silence inside their walls, spaces unmapped, unmonitored, and waiting, and simply haven't been found yet. If this story made you think differently about the systems we take for granted, there are more investigations like this one waiting for you here. Subscribe and stay curious.